Hello, welcome everybody to my History 3600 presentation. Now, this one is on Chinese immigration. When I saw what we had to do for this presentation, the first thing I think of when I think of Chinese immigration, especially in the 19th century, is I think of the Chinese Exclusion Act that was signed in 1882 by President Chester Alan Arthur. Now, though, the question I really want to answer is how did they feel about Chinese immigration years before the Chinese Exclusion Act was signed? And this leads me to my historical argument that America passed the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 motivated from anti-Chinese sentiments after Chinese immigrants would not assimilate to the customs and culture of the 19th century United States. So what this is pretty much saying is that the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was signed because Chinese immigrants wouldn't assimilate to American customs. For example, this is what they did to Native Americans with the Dawes Act years later. My first piece of evidence would be a California newspaper that was published in 1880, so 2 years before the act was signed. And they shared their sentiments through a poll. The poll showed that a majority of citizens wanted to prevent Chinese illegal immigration. For an example, 154,638 people were asked. And out of those, 153,755 did not support Chinese immigration. So this means almost 99% of Californians did not want Chinese immigration. So you would think it is because of, quote, cheap Chinese labor overtaking American jobs. But then when you go to the next page, the newspaper claims that Chinese immigrants were, quote, inferior to any class ever quartered upon this soil. Habits of life represent the lowest condition of any scale of humanity. And they even said this in the next page with, quote, a deformed wooden image he worships as his god. He indulges in vices which enlightened men hold in detestation, but which are tolerated in his own country. He takes no interest in those things that increases national prosperity. And this is the quote. Now, another piece of evidence I would say is another congressional. And this one is them drafting the law that would become the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So Chester Alan Arthur vetoed the bill because it said 20 years, but he signed it when it was in 10 years. So this is what they had to say, Congress had to say about Chinese immigrants. Quote, they come into this country without wives, families, they retain their own characteristics, refusing to assimilate to our institutions, remaining a distinct class. And this sentiment was further carried on in the next page by John F. Smith, who was a representative in California. He talks about the bill. He believed that a 10-year suspension would do worse than nothing at all, because after 10 years, the country would be in turmoil. Quote, 20 years is the very shortest period in which the evil can be brought under control. This is awful stuff. Now, in the next one by Professor Yoon, it talks about on page 253, petition 25, where a lot of Chinese laborers said this about the current jobs they have. Quote, we did not expect to work in a foreign country and we are treated worse than prisoners. We are sinking in a strange place and living in a hell on earth. So obviously it means the conditions were pretty awful. If you're still healthy, you'll be bullied by the rich or the government officials, or will be forced to sign another contract, or will be forced to work in the official workshop, or will be put in prison. So this obviously shows anti-Chinese immigrants' sentiment, because the people who are giving these Chinese laborer jobs have them working in awful conditions. And this quote really expresses a lot of my historical argument. Quote, moreover, this country has set up a cruel policy, stating that the Chinese who have contracts here have to convert to Catholic and find a Cuban as godfather after the contract expires. Now, with all three of these sources, quote citations, with all these sources, it is to make believe that a lot of sentiment between whether it was Americans or politicians really did not like Chinese immigration because they thought the Chinese immigrants were inferior class and needed to assimilate to America. And since Chinese immigrants would not do that, they believed that the only option was to deport them. Now,